Okay, hi everyone, and welcome. I'm Dan Twining. I'm president of IRI. Great to see you here, and those of you joining us virtually. We will have a moderated discussion up here, hear more from Thibault about his excellent book, which is available for purchase on Amazon and elsewhere, and has a bonus foreword by Daniel Twining. So hopefully he will whet your appetite. Okay, yeah, if you just read the foreword, you'll know exactly what the book is about. No, Thibault will whet your appetite. So we'll look forward to hearing from all of you who are here, as well as who are joining us remotely. Briefly to introduce Thibault, he's been with IRI since 2011. He previously, before that, worked for Nicolas Sarkozy in France and for the British Conservative Party. He has worked for us in a number of cities around Europe, doing kind of political party development and alliance building and outstanding work, including on really forging new transatlantic alliances to counter emerging dangers and challenges like Chinese malign influence in Europe, like Russia's assault on the principles of the free and open international order. So Thibault, we're very delighted to have you with us. You wrote your book. I don't want to sort of tell your story for you, but you wrote your book before war in Europe broke out. So to your great credit, you wrote this book at a time of peace in Europe. And who would have known that production on it would be finished less than 1 month before Russia destroyed the peace of Europe and brought war to Europe. So please, could you tell us a little bit about kind of the personal backdrop to this book for you, and then we'll kind of get into some of the substance.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Dan. Hi, everybody, and thanks to you all for coming, and thanks, Dan, for having me here today. The story of the book, I mean, it's call it fate or the strangeness of things. I started writing on the book in 2019. And the first few words of the introduction and the first chapter was written while I was on vacation with my wife. My wife is Ukrainian. She's from Eastern Ukraine. We were in where my in-laws were living at the time, which is Izium, which is where the family is from. Izium, as you may know, now is a famous town because it sits in the Kharkiv Oblast, but it is now occupied by Russia because it sits right in between Kharkiv and Donetsk. And so I started to write it there after having sort of looked at the situation in Europe and seeing that the situation was deteriorating fast. And going into Izium and starting writing in Izium actually was a very symbolic thing, because being in Izium, you could understand that it was no longer peace. We're already in Eastern Ukraine at the time. It was a war that was not telling its name. Izium was 60 kilometers far from the front. You could feel it when you arrived in Izium, because like a lot of people had left. We did one day trip to Sviatohirsk, which is a small town in the Donbass with a monastery. That place, which now has been destroyed by the Russian Patriarchate, but destroyed by the Russians, to tell you the amount of destruction that these people are bringing to this area. But going there, you actually went by train, and you had already checks by the army. You could see the army already there in the small bunkers, et cetera. So it was not war yet, right? Because there were trains, there was a civil life, but you could see that it was not peace anymore. And the thing is that when we look at our relationship with Russia now, for example, and now nobody can hide the fact that there is war in Ukraine. Actually, there has been war in Ukraine ever since 2014. I think people can tend to forget that, or it was convenient, let's say, to forget about that, including for people who filled in their pocket with Nord Stream 2. Not that they didn't get warnings from us before, but anyway, the fact is that today we are still in a half denial. Yes, there is war in Ukraine, but when it comes to the West, when it comes to Europe, there has been until recently a sort of denial that we may not be at war with Russia, but we're already no longer at peace with Russia. And I think some people are starting to talk about economic warfare, economic war with Russia. And that's something that I talk about in the book. We're already into economic war with Russia, the West in general. And Putin is actually making it very clear. This is something that is very interesting about this war. Nothing of what is happening right now should be surprising to any European, because the Russians have been clear from the very beginning about their objectives, about what they thought about Ukraine. Vladimir Putin told George W. Bush famously in 2008, this is not even a country, right? 2014, you had the whole narrative about Novorossiya, which was the new Russia, which was a way to deny the right of Ukraine to exist. And then, we get back to this in 2022, and people are surprised. But, where were you people? All these pseudo-realists who are saying, like, you need to take the world as it is. Well, maybe they're the ones who didn't see the world as it was, and maybe they were trying to look at it in their own with their own rosy glasses, or there might have been other reasons why they did that, and whether that had to deal with money, but that's another issue.
Okay, so we'll come back to the current war in Europe, but I want to rewind because your book is actually very historically learned, and I think what I most enjoyed about it, in addition to some of your future forecasts for all sorts of different conflicts in Europe beyond Russia, Ukraine, what I most enjoyed about it was sort of the sense of history that you bring. Europe was forged in war. Europe invented the forms and tools of modern warfare. Why was Europe actually, unlike the zone of peace and prosperity that we imagined it to be, at least until February, why was Europe so bloody and martial for so many centuries?
Right. So this would require a very long answer, but very shortly.
Give us a taster so that
geography, very shortly. Geography, culture, pretty much everything in Europe makes it a continent of war. This is one of the things we tend to forget. Like, we have learned in Europe, Europeans, people in the EU, we have learned to think Europe is peace, and we tend to put Europe and European Union in France or in other countries or in Italy. It's like Europe is the European Union, and there is a confusion here, because the reality is that if you take Europe as a continent, Europe is all about war. If you look at the history of Europe, it's a history of war. This is the very reason why Europeans went out and took over basically the world up to the 19th century, was because it was all because of war. The culture, the geography, when you have so many coasts, so many peninsulas, so many islands, so many mountains that that basically divide different parts of the continent between each other, this is the best way to have a continent at war. The only reason why Europe became a continent of peace is that Europe killed itself, committed literally suicide between 1914 and 1945. And the only way to get out of this, cycle, because of technology had made war so lethal, right? The only way to get out of this cycle of warfare was to have two outside powers, right? The Soviet Union and the United States, to sort the problem out. That was the only way. And then they built a new order, one that was based on freedom and democracy in the West, and another one that was based basically on a modern way of slavery and a population control in the East. That was the only way. That was the way it went out between 1945 and 1989. And then after 1989, the Pax Americana, because it was a Pax Americana, it was a Pax Europea, but that Pax Europea was not possible without the presence of American troops in Europe. And actually, it's the Europeans who came to the Americans and said, please stay. Right? Between 1945 and 1949, it's the Western Europeans who asked the Americans to stay, and the Americans who said, yes, we're going to stay, but get your act together, which is why we tried and failed to build a European community of defense, right? So after 1989, we got into this position where there was this idea of a Europe whole and free, and at peace, right? Which was the mantra of George H.W. Bush from the Mainz, speech of 1989. And the problem was that we all forgot that the reasons why there was peace in Europe, well, the reasons why there had been peace in Europe for such a long time, and the reason why we're continuously at peace now in the whole of Europe, almost, was a very specific set of circumstances, and that peace was very fragile. Instead, and you can blame, to a certain extent, Fukuyama for that, or maybe the people who read Fukuyama and read him wrongly, because the idea was that everything was going to be automatic. From 1991, it was the end of history. Everything was going to be automatic, and nothing is automatic. Nothing is granted, or nothing is to be taken for granted. And I think we forgot about that, and we forgot that, particularly in Western Europe, that Russia remained a threat. We forgot in other quarters that a country like Turkey had seen the end of the Ottoman Empire not as a great thing, but as a humiliation, and denied the genocides that were going on, during the breakup of that empire. Everybody forgot that there were issues in the south that were brewing, and everybody forgot that inside Europe there could be social problems and identity problems which were homegrown that could just spin out of control. And I think we are now in this situation in 2022, in which, yes, there is war in Ukraine that could spill over, but there are also a lot of problems inside the European Union, inside some countries like France, where social tensions are very high, where identity questions are very high. You can look at Spain with Catalonia, and you see like a lot of issues, a lot of problems that have grown up in the 2010s in Europe, that are extremely worrying. I mean, I mentioned Catalonia. The Western Balkans is another region where there are a number of issues, and you can see things spinning out of control. So the question is, did the COVID-19 crisis put an end to all this, and now we're in a new cycle that is going to be positive, or was it just a training lab before something much more sinister comes in? And you think about Catalonia. Catalonia happens. Yes, because there happened the referendum in 2017, happens because there has been a plan from the Catalonian elites to push for independence, but also because the economic crisis has made it so that the only way for the local elites to find a culprit that was not them was to say, oh no, we're not corrupt, it's Madrid who is robbing us, and who is robbing you. So things can very, very easily spin out of control. And if we are not careful, if we take peace for granted, then we will definitely lose it.
Okay. I want to ask you about the period from 1945 to 1989, and then the period from 1989 essentially until February. It wasn't actually that peaceful. This idea of Europe as peace and that we held the line. There were nuclear crises over Berlin. There was the Soviet armed crushing of democratic revolutions in both Prague and Budapest during the Cold War. Obviously, there were the Balkan explosions of the 90s. There was the Russian invasion of Georgia. Could you talk about, and then you mentioned that actually Russia has been at war against the West for a period of years now. But could you describe when you think things changed, that this very fragile peace, what were the first glimmerings that caused you to forecast the return of war to Europe?
So I think Crimea is really the turning point. But when we talk about peace in Europe, or the peace that we've lived, that Western Europe has lived for the past 75 years, it is exact that taken broadly that there has been peace, but there have been very short, small wars that reminded us that war was never far. You mentioned a lot of wars. One is also the Turkish-Greek War of 1975, which was short, and it ended up in the partial occupation of Cyprus by Turkey, and it's still unresolved, and it might explode in our faces in the next few years. But there have been a lot of skirmishes that could have been ended up being wars, or could have been taken as wars. Budapest, 1956. 1968, the Czech Republic. I mean, in every other era, it would have been called an invasion. of a sovereign country by another. But because of the Brezhnev doctrine and because we kind of accepted it, it was not considered as an invasion or war. So things can spin out of control. I think really really when we got into another era in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea and signaled that the borders were no longer sacrosanct. But I would say that the real turning point was probably 2008, the financial crisis that gave the impression to a lot of people, including in Europe, that the period of Pax Americana was over, that, including in America, by the way, that the West was over. And that's something that I saw in France. The Nicolas Sarkozy, for whom I worked at the time, changed his attitude from being very pro-American prior to 2007, 2008, to afterwards, there was a sort of rapprochement with China, with Russia, because a number of people around Sarkozy and Sarkozy himself had been led to believe that the period of Pax Americana was over, and that there was some other solution needed to be found. And truth be told, I think that there was not enough of a pushback from America, because America was and is still doubting about its power, but there was not enough of a pushback. And the result was that when the main guarantor of peace, ultimate guarantor of peace, starts to pull out, this is when things start to go wrong, right? So really, this idea of the weakening of the West, the weakening of American guarantees of security, is something that was internalized by a lot of people. And we have a chance now. Weirdly enough, 2022 might be the signal, right? That maybe the tables are turned. I think a lot of people in America, and hopefully we at IRI have been instrumental also in getting people to understand that no, China is not a neutral actor. It is a threat, not only to America, but also to you Europeans. No, Russia is not just a partner like any other. So hopefully we have been instrumental in that. But I think now people are realizing that things are not like that the Wandel durch Handel does not work like that. Maybe it works the other way. That it is us who change through trade, not the others. So I think really get to answer your question, 2008 and then 2014 were really the turning points.
Okay, so I want to come back to this question of, does 2022 mark a pivot point in terms of America's recommitment to Europe? But in the meantime, let me ask you, I think all of us in the foreign policy community look at these big macro stories, Russia invading Ukraine, the US security guarantee to Europe. But there are a bunch of micro sources of conflict in Europe that date to the history of nationalism and empire in Europe. You mentioned Catalonia and other secessionist movements. There is Balkanization, including in the Balkans, and sort of the idea of, Greater Serbia. I'm trying to be delicate in my descriptions here, but there is a form of revanchist nationalism in the Balkans. There are fissures within the EU. Think about Hungary and Poland versus the perspective in Northern Europe or Brussels. There is a line between at the east of Europe, the center of Europe, who always understood the nature of Russia, and major countries in Western Europe, other than Great Britain, who I think forgot and believed in change through trade. So could you talk a little more about, beyond Russia, Ukraine, some of these other sources? There's also, of course, the history of Ottoman imperial rule in Southeastern Europe.
So, here again, if we were to start this conversation, we'll need to get a timer to make sure that we don't go over time. But there are many, you have many options. There are many scenarios that you can think of, things going badly. In order to understand how things could go wrong, there are two concepts that need to be explored. The first one is the idea of a center and a periphery. And I think, Europeans do not think of that enough, that, Europe is taken as a continent, also taken as European Union, which is a large union, is just like in America, is a place where there is a center, or there are centers, and the periphery. In the US, it's very clear that there are economic, political centers that are on each of the coasts, and then the center of the country is the periphery. And I'm not saying that in any trying to downplay anybody, but this is a reality. And in Europe, you have exactly the same. You have one center, which is the northwest of Europe, which now is cut in two by Brexit, and that's in itself is a danger. And then you have peripheries in the south and the east of the country, in of the Union. East, we all know about it because we've been working in this area for a very long time. The European plain, the northern plain, is completely open from Vladivostok to Paris. Basically, that's why the Cossacks ended up in Paris in 1813. That's why the Soviets ended up in Berlin in 1945. That's also why the Poles ended up in Moscow and Napoleon after them earlier on. So I mean, obviously, and the money making is being done in Northwestern Europe. However, I mean, I do not want to feel like I'm downplaying the economic miracle of Poland, of Hungary, of all these countries that have done tremendous efforts and have gotten much richer over the past 20, 30 years. And this is all to their credit. But the reality today is that if you take, I mean, let's be blunt, if you take France and Germany, how much do you think of the total GDP of the EU 27 that represents? 42%. Two countries, 42% of Europe's GDP. Add Italy, which everybody sees as a not so serious country, right? Including, let's be honest, including in Europe, and the Italians hate it, rightfully so. Italy, which is the third biggest economy in the EU and the second biggest industrial power, you get to 55%. So three countries make 55% of the European economy. And if you look at the numbers, first of all, if you look at Italy, the north is all of these, of these 15%. The south is nothing. So you really have, you really see in Italy where the line lays in terms of northern versus southern Europe and east and west. But really, you can see in Europe that there is a core and there is a periphery, and not enough people see that. And the problem is very often in the peripheries. So that's one concept. The problem, Spain with Catalonia, Italy, which is a country that is only 150 years old. We tend to think of Italy as a natural thing. We also tend to see democracy as a natural thing in Southern Europe. Well, guess what? Spain's democracy, Greece's democracy are only 15 years older than Ukraine's or Poland. Right, so this is one periphery. The other periphery, of course, is Central and Eastern Europe, which is different weaknesses and different threats, but they are there nonetheless. And then the second thing is the idea of decline, which is somewhere that is present everywhere in Europe. If you listen to Viktor Orban's speech in Bajletușnad last week, that was all about this, the weakness of Europe and the decline of Europe and how to get out of this sense of decline. And here there are, countries that could be vulnerable to that could even be in the core. I mean, I have a French colleague here. He knows very well that this was the idea of decline was at the center of the speech elements of someone like Eric Zemmour in France, who was at some point at 15% of vote intentions. So this idea that we are in decline and we need to do something about it before it's too late is extremely dangerous. This is what drove the Europeans to war in 1914. They were on top of the world, but they were obsessed by the idea of decline. And they said, better start a war now to stop the decline. It's going to be a risk, but we're stopping the decline now before it's too late, before we go into a place that is much worse. So these two ideas, decline and center versus periphery, including the tensions between the center and the periphery, are going to be, I think, the drivers of tensions that Europeans are going to need to manage, that we're going to need to manage in the future if we want to avoid war.
Okay, thank you. That's super interesting. I want to ask you, as a historian of war in Europe, about the war, the Russian war on Ukraine. How is it going to end? And has anything that has developed in the last 5 months here surprised you?
So the the way I think everybody was surprised by the way the war in Ukraine went. I know very few people who would have bet even on the day after the start of the invasion that simply that Ukraine would not be taken over by the Russians very rapidly. There were very few voices that doubted that. I think it became clear after day one that things were much more complicated for the Russians. But when you think about it, it's details. It's a question of details. Had the airport in Hostomel been taken over by the Russians, the airport in Hostomel was taken by the Russians. Had there not been a successful counterattack by the Ukrainians, had Zelensky decided to flee Kiev as he was invited to by us, right? Then we would probably be living in a very different Europe and a very different world today. The Russians might have a lot of problems trying to control Ukraine right now, but maybe they would have taken over parts of it or all of it. So I think we need to be, even for people who got it right, at least on one thing, we have to be humble. So I think there's a lot of surprises that are still in the making. Right now, we have no idea what's going on in Kherson. And I think the Ukrainians are doing it on purpose to tell us so that we do not know what's going on in Kherson. My hope is that the Ukrainians successfully take over Kherson or Melitopol, cut the Russians in two, we get to a peace very quickly. To those people who say, you're a warmonger, I usually answer that, listen, my in-laws are living with me as a result of the war. Nobody else, nobody in this room at least, wants more the war to end than me, right? But it cannot be on their conditions. It has to be, on our conditions, and that's what a lot of people do not understand, including in Europe. So I think right now we're still it's still very uncertain. I think we've understood that the Russians were probably not going to be ever able to take over Ukraine. But right now, we do not know if Ukraine can take over the territories that have been invaded. I'm hopeful that they can, but this is still a question mark, and we'll have to see in the coming month if there is this possibility. I think if Ukraine manages a counteroffensive in Kherson or in Izium or somewhere else that is successful, then the whole Russian narrative of not only the invincible army, but the inevitable defeat of Ukraine that falls apart, and then we live in a completely different world. But then, whether I'm not a military expert, and I do not know if Ukraine right now is capable of doing that. I think the weapons that we're sending are clearly turning the tide, but to what extent, up to where, this is something that is still an unknown. So I wouldn't bet on anything right now.
Okay, I'm going to ask you just one more question and then open it up. So please get ready in person here and virtually, because we want to turn to you. I have a lot more questions, so I can keep going, but I'll just ask one more, then open it up. Thibault, I want to draw you out on really what I think is perhaps one of the most interesting contributions to this book, which are your different scenarios for the future of conflict in Europe. And I want to ask you about, just to describe several of them to us, but you mentioned the idea of Europe as a playing field in a new Chinese-American Cold War. Could you draw that scenario out a little more for us, please?
Sure. So it's one of the 7 scenarios that I explore, and there are many others that are maybe more obvious that I didn't explore, such as a war between Greece and Turkey, which is actually not very far away if we look at how the buildup in the Aegean Sea and the Eastern Med is going right now. But this scenario, and it follows the logic of the initial parts of the book. But when you think about it, the reason why there was no war in Europe, the reason why the Cold War was also a long peace, was that Europe was the big prize. It was the ultimate prize. Whoever won in Europe was winning the Cold War. So nobody really wanted to touch it, just in case everything crumbles down. And if you were to start war in Europe in 1968 or 1975, then first of all, it was Armageddon. most probably. And second of all, you are basically gambling on the future of your country over one roll of dice, right? Today, Europe is no longer so central. So in many ways, Europe can look like what Southeast Asia looked like in the 1950s, right? This could be a prize that could be worth trying to get. It is a prize definitely for China, because that's where their economic output goes to, right? This is where they're doing a lot of their exports. This is a prize obviously for the United States, because this Europe that we're seeing right now has been shaped by America for the past 100 years. This is the Europe that America made. And the moment that basically the Americans go, this is going to be a completely different Europe, particularly in Central Europe, I would say. So let's imagine for a second that, let's put the Russians out of the picture for a second, and let's imagine that war starts over Taiwan. Usually wars can be very, very short. There is a battle. The battle is where two armies meet. One is completely destroyed. You have a new equilibrium, a new balance of powers that comes out, on which both powers are agreeing on, and then the war is over, and then we start another cycle. But as we're seeing in Ukraine, it doesn't always work like that. So let's imagine there is an attack over the Strait of Taiwan. That the attack, that there is a naval battle. The naval battle is inconclusive. And the Americans and the Chinese know very well that if there is a direct confrontation, the direct confrontation will lead to Armageddon. So they're going to find, like in the Cold War, other places where they can play their rivalry out, right? And Europe being a big prize where, order has little by little fallen down, is a big prize. And China has allies. It has allies. It could have allies. If I look at the situation right now, it could have allies in Belgrade. It could have allies in Hungary. It could have allies, or maybe other countries, right? It might not be these countries in the end. And the thing is, in world politics and geopolitics, very often the overlord is not that much in control. It's very often the smaller guys that are much more in control and that can bring total chaos. So you can very well imagine, let's imagine, for example, a change of government in Italy with a pro-Chinese government, let's say a new five-star movement with pro-Chinese elements that say, the Americans need to go home. You Americans go out of Taranto, you Americans go out of the base at Aviano, and obviously propped up by the Chinese. And we're going to open a new base in a new Chinese base, let's say in Sicily or somewhere else. You can imagine the tensions grow up, and then you see, oh, there's going to be war in Italy. But then it's the thing is in Belgrade. It's in Belgrade. The president in Belgrade, as the president of Serbia, said, oh, this is the moment where I can actually use my influence and my friendship with the Chinese to take over the places that belong to me, but that the Americans have not allowed me to take back in the 1990s. And then you find yourself with a crisis in the Balkans, which leads to war. And then you find yourself with a crisis in Eastern Europe because one country has decided that its special relationship with the Chinese allows it to change the borders that it's not happy with ever since, whether it is 1919 or 1945, whatever. So, you can see things getting out of orders, not necessarily, not because Europeans are bad or by nature, but just because the circumstances change. And when an area starts to be contested, things can go wrong very, very quickly. And I think we saw that in the 1930s. There was nobody to withhold the order that had been created by the Americans, the English, and the French in 1919. And there were a number of powers that were contesting that order, and things unraveled within 8 years. Between 1933 and 1939, within 7 years, that order was gone.
On that cheery note, let's turn to the audience. I will turn to the room, but let me just ask my external affairs colleagues, how can people watching virtually ask a question or make a comment? Drop it in the chat. Okay, drop it in the chat if you're watching virtually. Questions, comments, insults to me only, not to Professor Muzergues. Okay, who in the room? Steve Nicks, please. Please use a microphone. Yeah, at the podium, at the stand.
Thank you, Thibault, for coming today. Thank you for putting this together. I haven't read your book yet, but I will. First of all, I want to thank you for bringing out, because I assume this is a big part of your book, that Ukraine has been at war with Russia since 2014. It's a fact that most people neglect or overlook. Certainly our European friends have overlooked it. John McCain was one of the people at the forefront right after Donbass, right after Crimea, that said, it won't stop here, which is why he fought so hard for the weapons. The list of weapons, by the way, which we brought here because President Poroshenko and Minister Avakov said, we're not sending this list of weapons that we want to the Pentagon. We're sending it to the chairman of IRI and asking him to go to bat. So thank you for pointing that out. On your premise that you're not sure what's going on in Kherson, I think we know what's going on in Kherson, and that's a major counteroffensive. If you look at the map strategically, there's two fronts right now, Donbass, Kherson. We all know Kherson is the key to everything. Because if Russia advances, they outflank the entire Black Sea coast. They take Mariupol, they take Odessa, move northward, link up with the Russian 14th Army in Transnistria, and that area encompasses what you mentioned, which again, most people don't understand, Novaya Russia, which is Putin's concept of what new Russia should look like. So I appreciate you bringing up these insights. I'll also say I'm a little more optimistic than you in terms of the outcome of this war. You have to remember 97% of the Ukrainian people in our polling data feel that their country will prevail. We assess that's because they feel they have no choice. If they fail, their country is destroyed, ruined, forgotten, eliminated. So I think that sentiment will prevail, and let's hope that we'll all be toasting to victory soon. But thank you for coming today and making these important points.
Thanks, Steve. And I mean, I am hopeful for Kherson. Don't get me wrong. I just right now I'm just in the position in the fog of war in which I not being a combatant and wanting the war to end quickly as well, right? I'm hopeful, but also we also need to understand that war is not an exact science, right? We cannot, and I think Vladimir Putin has given us a very good example of it. I think he thought this would be over in just a few days. But once you said that, right now we're hopeful that the counteroffensive in Kherson or elsewhere, because Kherson might be just a flare-up for maybe an offensive on Melitopol that would surround the Russians in Kherson and then force them to peace. I'm hopeful, but I also want to be careful not to rejoice before I can send my in-laws back home.
Thank you. Hal Ferguson, you may make sure that microphone is on, please.
Yeah, Thibault, thanks again. Really fascinating presentation. My question to you is on some of the other stressors in Europe that could be causing fragility, seen and unseen. I think Putin's invasion of Ukraine has revealed the fragility of the political system in Europe, but there are others that, to me, as a relatively uneducated outsider when it comes to Europe, even I can see there are some real stresses in the system there. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on some of these things and their potential to lead to war. For example, migration, right? Europe has seen huge waves of migration coming in from Africa, the Middle East, elsewhere, that has visibly, clearly caused political stress and instability on the continent. A secondary effect of course, the Ukraine war is the fragility of the food system, which has affected Europe much less, it seems, than elsewhere in again, Africa, Middle East. But that could be another source of potential fragility there. And then also, climate change and other things that may change the economy or the underlying sort of fabric upon which these nations are built. And so I'm curious if you've got any insights in some of the underlying factors that aren't as robust as they used to be, that they themselves could lead to real instability and war on the continent. Thanks, Thibault.
Thank you, Hal. So I mean, let's talk first about the regions, and then then that will lead us to the factors. Right now, I see two regions, which are, I mean, obviously, that if war breaks out, it will not be in those two regions; it will be somewhere else. Actually, three regions. There's the Baltics, clearly, but the Russians first would need to chew Ukraine well before they attack the Baltics. But let's remember that the territory that the Russians are occupying is basically much more than what the Baltics represent in terms of superficie. So if the Russians get their way now, the Baltics are going to be next. That's one thing. Second area that is highly problematic is the Western Balkans. Russia has a lot of friends there. There are a lot of actors who have their own agenda. There is money that is coming from all sorts of places to the Western Balkans, including the Gulf, including Turkey, and we don't know how. And things are heating up out there. I mean, we met some representatives of the Croat HDZ earlier this year in Rotterdam, and what I heard from them, and they are the nice guys. They are quiet and all that. What I heard from them was very worrying about the atmosphere that there is right now in a place like Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, or take a place like Macedonia. So Kosovo is also a place where things could go wrong. And then there is the Eastern Med, and that will lead me to the factors. The Eastern Med right now, the temperature is up once again. Turkey and Greece are at loggerheads. The Greeks are persuaded that because of demography, the Turks will sooner or later try to take the islands of the Aegean Sea. The Turks have started what they call the Blue Homeland Project, which is a way basically to project naval power over the Eastern Mediterranean so that they can link up the Turkish homeland to former lands that used to belong to the Ottoman Empire in Africa, that can bring them what they want in terms of energy, in terms of a number of primary sources that they need for their industry. All of what I'm saying sounds terribly like the 1930s, right? But this is unfortunately how things are playing out in this region. So I'm also very worried about the Eastern Med. I think people do not pay attention to this region, and yet the Mediterranean is where all of the crises, including the ones that are playing out in Ukraine, are converging. Fun fact, do you know why Athens was able to withstand any siege during 40 years during the Peloponnesian Wars? They could be besieged, they could have their hinterland ravaged by the Spartans, but still the city would hold, because their grain, the cereals, were coming from Pontus Exenus, which is the present-day Black Sea. And when we're talking about the present-day Black Sea, that was from north, from what is present-day Crimea, Ukraine, and Russia, which is where the Greeks had a presence. And they still have a presence. The reason why there is a Greek presence in Mariupol dates back to those days. So the Mediterranean is a key for the food security, because if you want to get grains from north to south, even if it's from the Black Sea, you need to go through the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is a key to the problem of energy security, because if you want to do without Russian gas, you will have to get LNG from North America, but the quickest way is to get gas from Algeria, gas from Libya, and gas from the reserves that we have found in the Eastern Med, Israel, Egypt, Cyprus, Greece. And there is one player here that doesn't have its share, and that's Turkey. And they're not happy about that. And they want to have their share. So how we work it out is going to be, a crucial part of, whether we keep war in Europe. Because I personally consider that the Aegean islands that are currently part of Greece are part of Europe and should stay part of Europe. And then you mentioned the migration crisis, and obviously this is something, a crisis where the Mediterranean will be at the center of. So add to that the fact that the Turks, the French, the Italians, the Greeks, the Israelis, the Egyptians, the Algerians are rearming fast because they see that the Mediterranean is getting crowded, and there's a number of issues that are not being worked out. Add to that the fact that the Russians are there because they used the conflict in Syria to modernize the base that they inherited from the Soviet days in Tartus. Add to that the fact that the Chinese would love to find a place for their fleet to anchor, right? Right now, they found a civilian port in Athens. They've been trying to buy a few ports in Italy. It is telling that the first base outside of Chinese territory that they built was in Djibouti, which is the entrance to the Red Sea. And the Red Sea is not important in itself, it's where it leads to, and that leads to the Mediterranean, right? So, in the Med, you have a number of tensions right now that are heating up, and this is why IRI is working on this actively to try and see how we can find a new security architecture also for the Mediterranean. So all of these things could really heat up and bring us a lot of problems if we don't take care of it.
Yes, thank you. The IRI angle here is that strong democracies are a source of security, and all of the threats you have described in this talk and in your book come from either very weak, backsliding democracies or from autocracies. Let's go to an online question or comment.
So I will begin with the first one, which is Robert Kaplan has written a new book entitled Adriatic, in which he identified that region as the future hub of China's entry into Europe, especially through the ports. If this is the case, how does China feature into future European wars?
Because we're running out of time, so can we take the other?
I do have another, yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, let's fast forward to the coming cold, dark, expensive winter in Europe. Can Europe somehow be prevented from giving in and pushing Kyiv to compromise? And what can Washington do about it?
Very good questions. You have 1 minute each.
Okay, that's going to be, so we'll try to make it quick.
We'll come to Nika for the last question, okay?
It's going to be a tough winter in Europe. It will take a lot of diplomatic skill for the US to get the Europeans to stay focused. I think by providing LNG to Europe, the part of the problem will be solved. The thing is that whatever happens, the Europeans will have to be careful on their energy consumption this winter, and there will be no way to avoid that. So I think America can help, but it needs to be helped also. Let's try to think of this as maybe not a new Marshall Plan, because Europe doesn't need a Marshall Plan, but selling LNG. I'm thinking about the Marshall Plan because this was something that was good for America. It brought new clients to America. So selling LNG maybe at a lower price on the market right now may convert into new clients. People will want, in Europe to get a safe source of energy in the future. And instead of taking the jackpot now and then leave, you can get, the jackpot every year and get a lot more money. On the Adriatic, yes, the Chinese are clearly thinking of this. Trieste is the entry point they are thinking of. It's not the only one. Genoa is another one. And we'll have to be very careful, watch how that plays out. The good thing about the Adriatic is that if you want to have a port infrastructure to go up the north to Northern Europe, where the market is, you need to go to the very, very bottom of the Adriatic Sea. And there are not that many options. There's Venice, and that's a bit difficult to build a port there because there's a big tourist attractions, including for Chinese tourists. And the other option is Trieste. So if we keep the Chinese out of these places, it's going to be very difficult for them to build something, for example, in Dubrovnik or in Podgorica. So, this would be, we need to think strategically of that place too.
Great virtual questions. I recommend all of Bob Kaplan's books. He has kind of reintroduced us to the determining power of geography in a kind of a synthetic way, which I think is very valuable. Okay, Nika Limitze, last question.
Hello, thank you so much for taking the time. 2 quick questions. First, why the choice of this specific cover? So Western perspective on Europe, but I don't see the Black Sea in there. Where's Ukraine? Where's Georgia? Where's Turkey?
The Mediterranean is in there for people who can't see the cover. And the UK has a central role in Europe in this map.
Right. And second question, what influence can money play? What role can money play? You said the negative impacts of money is to corrupt, and maybe to weaken us from the inside, but what about the positive, like 3C initiative or something like that?
Thanks, great questions. So first the cover. So the other option indeed would have been to have Central Europe, but Central and Eastern Europe is so obvious in some ways that I found it would be more impactful to get people to understand that even in places that like the UK, like Spain, like France, like Italy, you can also have war. So if we do not work on this, it's not only Central Europe or Eastern Europe that's going to be at war, but we're all in this together. So that was the idea. And of course, Central and Eastern Europe is more, as we said, there are more threats, more direct threats for Central and Eastern Europe. But the idea was really to show that we're all in this together. And if we don't think about it, Western Europe also can be a target and can be at war. And actually, if you think, for example, of 2016, when you were in the streets of Kiev in 2016, you didn't feel that you were at war, that this was a country at war. I can tell you, when you were in Paris in 2016 with all the militaries around and the importation for a very short period of time and on a very small area of a scene of war with the terrorist attacks, you felt that you might be in a country at war. So really the idea was to try and show that. And your second question about the money. Yes, geoeconomics is extremely important. Economic warfare is extremely important. But if we want to keep Europe a stable and secure place, it needs to be a prosperous place. And I think one of the reasons why the southern periphery is at stake today is because there hasn't been development for the past 20, 30 years. This is why you have a degradation right now of the security situation in Southern Europe. So how do we get back to prosperity? How do we in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, after the crisis of 2008, after the crisis of 2020, after the invasion of Russia, how do we get back to a prosperous Europe is something that the Europeans are going to need to work on, because we can't always ask our American friends to sort out our problems.
So just to conclude, this has been really far-ranging and inspiring, Thibault. But I would like to point out, I pushed this out on Twitter just a couple weeks ago. I think it came out of The Economist or the FT. The free world trades and invests a lot more with each other than it does with, say, China or Russia. I think there is a misunderstanding, an analytic misunderstanding out there that we are all utterly dependent on China or on Russian energy, including in Europe. Europe is unduly dependent on Russian energy, but in fact, trade and investment ties between the United States and the European Union, or between North America and the Union, are thicker than any other such set of relationships. And we should remember this when we think about kind of the geoeconomic side of the equation. Because it's not just about security collaboration, obviously, or shared values, which are so foundational. So Thibault Muzergues, thank you. War in Europe, from impossible war to improbable peace. We're a little worried about you having to change the title in the next edition of this because it's looking like a less and less improbable piece. But thank you for this outstanding contribution. We're very proud to have you as a colleague at IRI, really helping drive our very dynamic work in the transatlantic strategy division and helping Americans and Europeans navigate this new world together. Slava Ukraine. Here's to winning the war and maybe taking one of these off the table for the next edition. Thank you all.